The focus of this lesson is on giving teachers strategies to use with students for close reading of a text. The text that we're going to use today is Life Doesn't Frighten Me by Maya Angelou. When conducting a close read with students, it's important to remember that a close read actually involves several readings of the text. During the first read, students are going to read the text independently. This is extremely important as students need the opportunity to interact with the text themselves before getting input from the teacher. As the teacher, we must be very careful not to front load the text. That means giving students information about vocabulary, major and minor themes, main ideas, and anything else that stands out to us as the teacher. We really want the students to have the opportunity to form their own opinion about the text and ask their own questions. During this process, we must give students tools to choose from to annotate the text. The tools that you choose should be things that you have already taught the students to use independently, and they now have the option to choose which one works best for them. Some popular tools that students like to use are sticky notes. Sticky notes are extremely helpful for those students who do not like writing on the text, but would rather write their notes on sticky notes and then place them next to the text in question. Another method of annotating the text is by using a highlighter. But some students still prefer good old-fashioned pencils and pens. These students like to write on the text, underlining, circling, and making question marks next to things that are confusing for them. Any of these methods are fine. Just remember, all methods should be taught first before students are given the opportunity to choose one that works best for them. Now we're going to have students go ahead and do their first read of the text, Life Doesn't Frighten Me by Maya Angelou. Remember to encourage students, as they are doing their reading, they should be taking notes, whether they are highlighting, writing in the margins, or using sticky notes. They should be making notes about questions they have as they read, as well as anything that stands out to them, whether they like it or dislike it in the reading. Once students have completed their first reading of Life Doesn't Frighten Me by Maya Angelou, they are going to be asked the following questions. What stood out to you, and what questions did you have? I've given you some examples of questions that students may come up with. Some students may immediately pull out the vocabulary word counterpane and have a question about that. Other students might immediately point to the fifth stanza. The fifth stanza creates interest for students because it doesn't fit the rhyme scheme of the rest of the poem. This would be a great point to encourage students to ask why they think this is happening. Why would the author make the conscious choice to change the rhyme scheme here? Students may also comment about stanza 8, in which the author tells us that there are panthers in the park. This often brings up the question, why would there be panthers in the park? Panthers are not an animal that you would normally see in a park. Remind students again that authors are very intentional, so when they put things in their text, they put it there for a reason. It is our job as the reader to explore the possible reasons that they made that choice. Once we've had some discussion during the first read of the poem, students will go in for a second read. During the second read of Life Doesn't Frighten Me by Maya Angelou, students will answer this question: is this poem written for a boy or a girl? They are trying to decide if the author of the poem wrote this poem to encourage little girls or little boys to not be afraid. During the second read of the poem, these are some of the notes that I've collected that students have made about the poem. Some students said, The poem was obviously written for a girl or for little girls because of the reasons highlighted in pink. This was their evidence from the text that this poem was written for a girl. Shadows on the wall and noises down the hall. Many students believed that little girls are scarier in nature and therefore would be scared of shadows and noises, as well as ghosts. These students also pointed to stanza 9 that reads, "That new classroom where boys all pull my hair." Clearly for some students this was written for a girl because the girl is referring to boys that pull their hair. Another student noted stanza 10, where it talks about frogs and snakes. This particular student felt that frogs and snakes are something that are very much particular to girls, or certainly within the stereotype of the way people see girls. Therefore, that's why that says it's written for a girl. Another student remarked that a male would never refer to something as a magic charm, very much a girl term. There are also those students who defend that this poem was written for a boy. Note the places marked in blue that indicate the reasons why this was written for a boy. One particular student referred to dragons breathing flame on my counterpane. Their comment was that little boys typically like dragons, and so the author was speaking to a boy because she was relating to something they could identify with. Another student felt that the entire stanza 5 referred to a boy because boys, by nature, will go up to something they're afraid of and challenge it. Other students remarked that tough guys in a fight is something that boys would concern themselves with and not girls. And if you look at stanza 10, another student remarked that "don't show me frogs and snake and listen for my scream" is actually referring to boys because boys should not be afraid of frogs and snakes, yet they are. Okay, last read. This time, when students read the poem, they are going to ask the following question. Could this poem have been written for an adult? And if so, who? During this read again, students are going to look for very specific evidence that this poem could be written for an adult. The poem being written for an adult typically generates a lot of conversation. Here are some of the responses in green as to why this could be written for an adult. For some students, when they saw shadows on the wall and noises down the hall, they thought about someone who was elderly. One student responded that as you get older, you find yourself being more fearful, and that's why an adult, an elderly person, would be afraid of shadows on the wall and noises down the hall. Another student thought about panthers in the park and strangers in the dark. They read stanza 8 and immediately interpreted that an adult, perhaps a female who was single, running in the park, might be the person who would benefit from reading about panthers in the park. The panthers would be symbolic of strangers in the park who intend to harm women as they go for a jog. Another student felt that this could have been written specifically for a teacher. They pointed to stanza 10 and stanza 11. This student felt that stanza 10 speaks to teachers because the teacher is thinking about dealing with children in the classroom who might pick up frogs and snakes and other things that they find outside and present them to the teacher. I'm guessing an elementary classroom mostly. I've got a magic charm that I keep up my sleeve. Stanza 11, students felt could have talked about a teacher because that teacher could have something that gets the students quiet and makes them ready to learn. Some students felt that the adult this poem could be referring to could be someone in the workplace. They looked at stanza 3 and saw the line about mean old Mother Goose. Their interpretation was that of a boss, someone who was mean and bossy and perhaps even a bully. Once you've allowed your students time to have some discussion over the many different people this poem could have been written for, we're going to look at the words that are repeated in the poem. The question that your students should ask themselves is, what do they hear being repeated over and over and over again in the poem? Life doesn't frighten me at all. When we see this, it's very tempting to simply say this is the theme or main idea of the poem and that's why it's repeated. But I encourage you to ask your students to dig a little bit deeper. Why else could this be repeated during this poem? Here are some of the answers that students gave. Many students felt it was to convince herself, the author, that she is not afraid. She kept telling herself this because if she said it enough, then perhaps she would believe it. Other students felt that it was repeated in order to reinforce to someone else that they don't have to be afraid, whether they are a child or an adult. So remember, when you are close reading with your students, there are several things that you want to keep in mind. You don't want to front load the text. Try and avoid giving students too much information about what they're about to read. It's important that they engage with the text on their own. Students should be given specific purposes for rereading. For our example, we read the text 3 times. Sometimes it'll be 2, and sometimes it might be more. What's important is that students have a very specific purpose every time they read the text. Giving students a choice of how to annotate their text is important. Make sure that the students have been taught the various methods first, and then allow the opportunity, when appropriate, to choose the best way for them to annotate the text. It's important that students have ownership of their own learning. Last but not least, you want to consistently model asking and answering specific questions about what the author said, the author's craft and style, specific choices that the author made in order to get you engaged, and also your interpretation of the text based on evidence that you've identified. Thank you for sharing. I look forward to seeing you again.